one of the things that I think, you know what? No, I'm not going to get into anything. We have to address one thing up top. We have to address the elephant in the room up top about this film and previous films. It needs to be said. There are 2 movies in the National Film Registry. This film and Gigi. 2 movies in the National Film Registry that feature an actor from the movie The Return of Swamp Thing.
Find him and bring him in.
We just need to get it out of the way. The listeners are going to be thinking about it the whole time. Every year since 1989, the Library of Congress has selected 25 films to add to the National Film Registry. The criteria? The films must be culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant.
Each week on You're Missing Out, we take a look at one of these films to try and get to the heart of why they were selected and why they still matter.
This week, Robert Bellissimo returns to the show for the 1948 drama Letter from an Unknown Woman.
Our guest today is the host of Robert Bellissimo at the Movies. Robert Bellissimo joins us on the show again, this time to talk about Letter from an Unknown Woman. Robert, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thanks, guys. Great to be back. Thanks for having me back.
Glad to have you back, buddy. It's always a pleasure talking to you about the cinema.
Absolutely.
And unintentionally, we wound up with a double feature here in a way because I didn't think about it until I was reading this right now. You were last on our show for A Woman Under the Influence, and you are on our show again this time for An Unknown Woman Who Wrote a Letter.
There we go.
It's really connective tissue
Ending
there.
with woman in the title, I'm your guy. I don't know if an unmarried woman is in the registry yet, but keep me in mind.
But Woman of the Year was Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn, I think, is. So,
there we go.
Yeah.
There we go.
Well, we do have, next season, we do have his Girl Friday.
That's true, but Tom, hey, that's Girl, okay? We haven't negotiated if Robert will come on for Girl movies yet, okay?
I'm just saying close enough. But
we got to deal with his people, the whole thing, his reps involved.
We're talking about the title. Let's get this out of the way. Bad title. Bad title.
Letter from an Unknown Woman or His Girl Friday?
Letter from an Unknown Woman. Bad title. He knew who it was.
Well, we'll get into that, right?
So, we're so glad to have you back on. You did our show for Letter from for Woman Under the Influence, and then Tom and I were supposed to do your show for something, and then for High and Low, and then only Tom could because I couldn't talk or breathe. So I was.
And you look better now.
Yeah. Oh, goodness. Yeah. Yeah.
Apply to him.
That was really one of those things. I remember, like, we were supposed to do it, and I emailed you, and I was like, I cannot. I am not in any shape. I'd undergone surgery and just was an absolute nightmare. But we're all functional now, so that's all working well.
Good.
Well, that's debatable.
We'll plan another one, but Tom and I had a good time talking about High and Low.
Yeah,
so.
I honestly even forgot it was supposed to be a double. But then again, I don't remember most things.
Tom, most times you forget we're both supposed to be on this show. You show up to the recording, you go, what are you doing here?
That's a problem.
Well, that's more like wishing that I wasn't on this show instead of forgetting. Kind of trying to vibe it into existence or non-existence, as it were.
Robert, we're so excited to talk about this, especially because I think it needs to be said. One of the things that makes this such an exciting prospect is that all three of us, big fans of film and cinema history. Letter from an Unknown Woman does not come up in conversation nearly as much as the more kind of established canonical classics. And it's fascinating because this one popped up, fourth year of the registry. It's inducted, but you don't hear it spoken of that often. I was fortunate enough to get the Blu-ray. Like, I think Olive Films did a short run of the Blu-ray, but it's not the most accessible movie in that regard. It's not the most discussed. So I'm really excited to have you on to get into this because it is such a fascinating movie that I don't know if you had the same experience that Tom and I actually watched it together, first time for both of us. I don't know if you had the same experience, but it's one of those movies that you kind of watch and go, yeah, how is this not one of the canonical? It just has the energy and the feel and everything of it feels like it'd be talked about that way, and it's not. So, had you seen this film or knew of this film before we started talking about this for the show? What is your familiarity with this film?
I hadn't seen it, but I'd wanted to see it for a while, and I also wanted to explore Max Ophuls' filmography more. I'd seen some of his movies. You know, when he went to the States, he did some really, really good film noir movies, like is it The Reckless Moment or A Reckless Moment? Which is with Joan Bennett, which I saw about a year ago, and that's another noir that is not discussed much, which is a shame because it's really, really good. And I wanted to get more into his filmography in general, but no, I hadn't seen it. And I thought, okay, well, it's a good opportunity to watch it and talk about it. And yeah, I put it on and I absolutely loved it. And I had the same reaction. I was surprised that it wasn't discussed very much. And I don't know a lot of people who know it. And when I watched it a second time, and just like any great work of art, I saw more. It made me think about other things that perhaps I didn't give much thought to the first time. And I just thought it was a really strong melodrama that there's so much to unpack. I mean, it's so nuanced and ambiguous and complicated. And I really loved it. So I'm looking forward to diving in more and talking about it.
Before we get into the registry statement and the film itself, I do want to, Tom, have you speak to this? Because I know, if you can remember however many months ago we watched this, I think it's fair to say we did like a triple feature of movies we knew we'd be doing on the show. And I think it's fair to say that before we sat down to do this, just based on title and brief synopsis you knew, I think it's fair to say you were maybe not super excited to get into this one compared to the other films you're talking about. And by the end, you were real into it. So if you could just talk a little bit about what that was kind of, the process was like for you from starting from a place of, I haven't heard of this and what is this going to be, through to like the way you felt about it toward the end when we watched it.
Well, yeah, because I mean, we've all said it. I mean, this is a movie like none of us had seen. It's not talked about canonically, so I just didn't know what it was, like what it was going to be, what the vibe was going to be like. And I didn't even look at I said it on the show before, when I get to a movie on this show that I haven't even heard of, I try to not even look into it before I watch it, because I'm just like, all right, how often do I really go into a movie completely blind? It doesn't happen with new movies because, we got marketing and I'm around for it. People saying, hey, did you hear about this new movie? But even with old movies, I buy a lot of discs. Obviously, you fucking people can see it behind me. So I tend to have a sense of what I'm buying or about to buy or watch. So I kind of just went in like, oh, okay. It's I guess a tragic love story sort of deal. All right, usually not my cup of tea, but I'll watch anything. And yeah, I really dug it. I really liked it a lot, and I watched it again yesterday in prep for today's recording. And yeah, I think it's just a really impressive movie with an impressive structure for still relatively early in film history. It's 48. We're not really getting that experimental storytelling wise and all of that shit. So I think and also just because I guess a big thing was in the last few years I've gotten very Douglas Sirk pilled, and this very, very much felt like a precursor to his melodrama work with Rock Hudson and all that, which is almost kind of like my only like real hard criticism of the movie. And it's not even a criticism, it's just I wish this was in Technicolor. Like I feel like this movie would like get over that hump of being talked about canonically if it just was lush and beautiful. And I don't know, like that's just me. But yeah, by the time the movie ended, I was mightily impressed. And rewatching it again, the ending really impressed me even more. And we'll get to that at some point. But a lot of this movie is just so goddamn impressive.
So before we talk any further and say what we thought of the film, let's hear what the Library of Congress had to say. Here's what the National Film Registry says about Letter from an Unknown Woman.
Max Ophuls had 18 European films to his credit when he fled Europe in 1941 for Hollywood, where he initially freelanced as a writer and director, and later helmed Letters from an Unknown Woman. The bittersweet costume drama set in 1900 Vienna is an intimate portrait of a woman, played by Joan Fontaine, and her consuming adoration for a charming, womanizing concert pianist played by Jourdan. Told primarily in flashback, the film's fluid, long takes, elaborate camera movement, opulent detail, and visual repetition are some of Ophuls' stylistic trademarks. Deemed too European and schmaltzy, the picture was a box office failure in the United States, but gained popularity through television in the 50s.
So, one of the things that I think, you know what? No, I'm not going to get into anything. We have to address one thing up top. We have to address the elephant in the room up top about this film. And previous films. It needs to be said. There are 2 movies in the National Film Registry. This film and Gigi. 2 movies in the National Film Registry that feature an actor from the movie The Return of Swamp Thing. We just need to get it out of the way. The listeners are going to be thinking about it the whole time. If we don't address it up top.
It's important to preserve the work of everyone involved in Swamp Thing and Return of Swamp Thing. 2 vital pieces of 80s cinema. Easily Wes Craven's high point. It's right up there with Hills Have Eyes 2 and Deadly Friend.
It really is a thing. Like I've been thinking about it a lot.
It almost makes you mad watching this movie and realizing like where this guy's career would end up getting to. Of just like, oh, dude, you had to do Swamp Thing, bro. Like, were you that hard off on tax money that you needed to do Swamp Thing?
Tom, you and I have texted when we were doing Gigi. We texted about this. We were texting about it with this film about Louis Jourdan being in Swamp Thing. And so today, I told you, Olive Films put out the Blu-ray for Letter from an Unknown Woman. They have a bunch of special features on there, and in one of them, there's a special feature just about the cinematography. And one of the talking heads in it, I'm like watching it, but I'm checking some emails, and I just hear him go, "Yeah, Louis Jourdan. I really only knew him from Swamp Thing," and I just wanted to throw my hands in the air and just go like, "All right, hell yeah, someone's saying it, someone's addressing it. It's wild." But yeah, 2 Louis Jourdan films back to back for us on this show: Gigi last season, and Letter from an Unknown Woman here. And I'm gonna be honest, having looked through the rest, I don't think we're getting to do many more.
I only know him
from the trilogy.
I only know him from Gigi because I thought he was so good in this. I thought, why? I don't know this guy from anything. And I was looking through. I think it was mostly TV and that he went into and stuff. So,
and as addressed, the Swamp Thing.
We all know what showbiz is like,
Now you're saying, hey Robert, you're saying you only knew him from Gigi. So is that you admitting on mic right now that you have not seen The Return of Swamp Thing?
I've never even heard of that. When you said that, I didn't know what you were talking about.
Oh, Robert,
I have no idea.
Robert, then I am so sorry. The next time you send an email going, "Hey guys, do you want to come back on my show? What do you want to talk about?" Because all we're going to do is just keep sending Return of Swamp Thing until you block us.
I'll consider it.
Listen, I'll just tell you now, your audience is definitely craving some Swamp Thing.
All right.
We're all craving some of that Swamp Boy.
You gotta always experiment, right? So who knows?
But to be clear, only Return of Swamp Thing. We do not do the first Swamp Thing. You have to figure it out from context clues. That's it.
And this was
I don't think
Craven did these?
He did the original.
He did the first one.
He did the first Swamp Thing, and then they did a sequel, Return of Swamp Thing, that I don't remember who directed it, but I think Heather Locklear is in it. I think.
Heather Locklear's
in Return, right? And Dick Durock?
Yeah.
That's
Dick Durock. Yeah,
that's another name I shouldn't pull. That's the guy. Anyway, none of we really did not expect this much Swamp Thing talk, but it needed to be addressed. We talked about this. We were talking about how this film isn't particularly well known outside of it's on the registry. It's talked about in that regard, but it's not one of the canonical classics. I do think it's interesting that, as the registry statement points out, this was not a success when it came out.
Right.
And I think that part of the reason, I agree with their assessment that part of it is the television airings. I do think the other element is, if you look at Max Ophuls' career in America, he came here fleeing, the Nazis. He was what they don't get into the registry statement, but his son Marcel has talked about was like Max was making propaganda against the Nazis. And I think a high-level Nazi official put him on the list of people to be killed.
Wow.
Goebbels had him on the list to be shot. So he came to America.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. And was very,
like a lot of those guys did then, Siad Mack and Fritz Lang
and Lubitsch,
Billy
a lot of
Wilder.
those guys, yeah. And weirdly, they were all apparently, or not weirdly, but they were all very supportive of Ophuls, right? They were.
Is that right?
When he came to Hollywood, they were all very supportive of him. The issue, I think, is
he's probably the only one who went back to
Yeah.
Europe. I can't think of many who then went back.
Well, it's a fascinating thing because he doesn't. There are a lot of his films now that you mentioned the oh my god, Reckless. What is the noir film? Reckless.
Yeah, A Reckless Moment.
Reckless Moment, and then the other one he did that I was watching a bit of before. He directed a film, like a swashbuckling film, written by and starring Douglas Fairbanks Jr., called The Exile. So he does a bunch of these films, but none of them quite land, right? None of them are like huge hits or anything. I do get the sense that when he goes back to Europe, because he's not getting any work here, he goes back to Europe, he starts making things like La Ronde and the earrings of Madame Day and those.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Right. He makes all of those films, and it does make you wonder if what kind of happened with Max Ophuls, as a director in the 40s and 50s is what ends up happening to a lot of those B-movie actors who go to Italy or France in the 60s and 70s, which is they weren't super appreciated here. They start doing some really cool stuff in Europe, and everybody in America goes, wait, hang on. We had that guy here? We had that guy here doing stuff? Because it does seem like once he makes La Ronde and all that stuff, like, people go, well, this Ophuls guy is really interesting. Oh, he was making movies here, and we were just ignoring him. Let's go back and revisit these, because, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's possible that I don't know, but I would imagine that he didn't have final cut in Hollywood, because I was watching an interview with his son talking about his last film, Lola Monte, and that he was somewhat like insisted, I've got to have. He's like Orson Welles. I've got to have final cut. I've got to have final cut. He and I can't, even in Hollywood, I think sometimes we forget very few directors have ever had final cut, particularly in the studio system. Yeah. So that might have something to do with it, I would imagine. But I'd have to dive in more to read why he decided to go back.
Well, I mean, I'm sure it's probably a lot of that, and it's also probably just a lot of, if he's not really having the successes that he wants.
Yeah.
And it's all because he must feel like, well, if you guys just let me make the movies the way I wanted to, they'd probably work out better. All that sort of frustration and what for. I also got to wonder if it is just a bit of the time period that wasn't doing him any favors, because, listen, this is my first Ophuls movie, but I have to assume a guy that was on a Nazi hit list is probably a guy that likes to stick to his guns and is not making the most joyous movies ever made, because this ain't a fun fucking film. This has a very unfortunate ending for the titular unknown woman. I gotta wonder if this era of Hollywood post-war, we're not really, America's not really looking for downer shit at the moment. I wonder if that must have had a little bit to play with this movie not being that successful at the time.
I think that's a factor. There's also, we'll talk about, there's a big factor that I was very surprised to discover with this film. But before we get to that, Marcel, his son, which, by the way, truly, I don't know why I never put it together, right? The first time we were watching this, I was just like, right, Max Ophuls, he makes La Ronde. I know Max Ophuls' filmography, and it didn't even occur to me, right? Oh, his son makes all of those very long, bleak, incredible documentaries. Like this is the son of the man who makes Letter from an Unknown Woman makes The Sorrow and the Pity and Hotel Terminus. I
gotta see those. I know they're like 5 hours or.
Sorrow and the Pity is a rough watch. It's very long, but it's a rough watch. But it's fast. It's fascinating to see how it shifts in that regard too, because Marcel talks about his father and saying, like, because his father made costume dramas, right, like The Exile, like Letter from an Unknown Woman, that people in Hollywood viewed him as, and these are Marcel's words, the unpolitical Jew. And Marcel's like, well, that's very much not my father. Like, he was a political guy. His films may not have been overtly political, but he was a political guy. And I do have to think, here's Marcel looking at his father struggling in Hollywood and being seen as the unpolitical Jew. And then Marcel makes Sorrow and the Pity, like one of the most scathing indictments of Vichy France, and makes Hotel Terminus and makes these, the most political movies, right? I think that's such a fascinating thing to observe the difference between. But the one thing I say when we're talking about the success this film had that I thought was fascinating, that I hadn't realized, is this is kind of, not entirely, this is kind of an independent film, right? So this was actually, this is what they would consider a semi-independent. So this was produced by Rampart Pictures, one of only 2 films that Rampart Pictures made. Now, they were borrowing studio resources, right? And that would, Universal would distribute this film, right? Universal, right? That's the distributor on this? Yes, right? Okay. Universal would distribute this film. How could I forget the vintage logo? So Universal would distribute it, and they were borrowing Universal resources, but this had a much smaller budget. It was being done in a sort of offshoot area. Rampart was in charge of it, and they had way less studio oversight, right? So Ophuls definitely didn't have final cut on this. I know the original cut of this film was 100 minutes, and it gets trimmed down to 84. We don't know. I couldn't find any information about how much was cut by Rampart or Ophuls, how much was cut by Universal. The special features in the Blu-ray suggest it may have been trimmed down to 84 so that it could be the second film on a double bill, and fit easier there. But I was just struck by this idea of this being kind of an independent film. Again, not totally, but sort of like, in modern parlance, like this would have been a Fox Searchlight movie. This is we produce it for a smaller amount of money. We hope it gets Oscar nominations. Otherwise, we're really not interested.
It was also Joan Harrison's husband, I believe.
Joan Fontaine?
Sorry, Joan Harrison. Joan Fontaine. I believe it was her husband.
Was the producer on it, right?
Producer, yeah.
Yes.
So I think he was looking for strong parts for her, and I read it was her favorite film that she ever did.
Yeah, and I think she's terrific in it. It's
she's fantastic. She carries the movie. If she doesn't work, the movie doesn't work. As much as you need Louis to really lay down the sleazy charm, it's her. Like, you gotta buy her journey, because otherwise the whole thing falls apart. I didn't know that the movie was cut by 14 minutes.
I didn't know that either.
It doesn't feel like a movie that's really missing anything.
Yeah.
That's like, I would love, it'll never happen, but I'd love to see the original cut, but it doesn't, I don't like, this doesn't feel like a Magnificent Amberson situation where you go, there's something missing here. It feels like a complete thought.
No, absolutely.
To me, at least.
I agree. And it's also, this is based on, unlike Ambersons, where Ambersons is based on like a massive novel, This is a novella, right? This is a very brief book, very brief story. I think it's like 80 something pages. I read it. It's also it's different. This movie definitely departs from the novella, but I have to say, I think in every way it's a positive. There's no duel in the book. The whole framework of a duel isn't in the book. So her husband isn't out for revenge. There's basically...
So do you think this one is ripe for a gritty reimagining in 2025?
Well, you know how much I love that, Tom. You know there's nothing I love more than when people go, the only reason those old movies weren't super violent and crazy is because they weren't allowed. So we're going to do it. It's my favorite thing. No, but this, I will say, on that note, Tom, I do... Jesus. That's a good segue. So you know how we don't find out that the son dies until the end of the movie? Like, we don't even find out there is a son? I would love to read, if you'll permit me, everyone, I would love to give you a little sampling of what I believe is page 6 of this book. Let's see.
Okay.
Here we go. My eyes would not stay open any longer. I was unaware of it when they closed. I slept sitting in my hard chair for 3 or 4 hours, and in that time, death took him. Now the poor, sweet boy lies there in his narrow child's bed, just as he died. Only his eyes have been closed, his clever dark eyes, and his hands are folded over his white shirt while the candles burn at the four corners of his bed. I dare not look, I dare not stir from the chair, for when the candles flicker, shadows flit over his face and his closed mouth, and then it seems as if his features were moving, that I might think he was not dead after all, and will wake up to say something loving and childish to me in his clear voice, but I know that he is dead. That is page, 4 of this novella. I just want to be clear, the absolute bummer that it starts out on, that I was just kind of shocked, that I'm like, man!
That's a good way to get your audience hooked. He's a dead kid.
But that's melodrama. They hit hard.
But to be clear, by this point in the novella, he does not know that's his kid. Some woman has just written him a letter and been like, hey, I'm just going to drop you a line. I don't ask you to know who I am. I don't expect you to remember me. Here's 3 pages on my dead son. Now let's get into this. It's a fascinating word, but I do think that you can really see, at least for me reading the novella, the structure that Ophuls brings to it. Because the novella, it's just, first of all, he's not a piano player in the novella. He's not a musician. He's a novelist. He's only known as the name R, and he's a novelist. And there's no, like I said, there's no duel. It's just, it's my birthday, and I got a letter. Huh. And it's kind of just like the entire momentum is the receipt of this letter and kind of the bleakness of it. And I do think that Ophuls figures out how to add, I think, more of a flow to it, more of a structure to it in a way that I think really benefits the story. And I'm not...
Well, and also just more of a thematic heft to his side of the story too, because otherwise he's just a guy getting a letter.
Correct. Yeah.
And he's just like, oh, okay. So you get this whole view of what his life has become, and then we're reading the letter as the movie goes on. You get that, all of that. And then by the end, which is what really struck me this time, and I really liked, because I think a lesser movie would have had him go out to the duel because of how broken he feels after reading the letter. I like it that it almost revitalizes him in a way where, knowing that he could have had all, this good stuff in his life and he lost it almost gives him, well, then maybe I can do it again. Maybe I actually can live a real life and not be this, at this point, middle-aged shitheel getting into duels for no reason. I don't know. Well, so I think giving that just makes it better.
I think that's a good interpretation, because I wondered why he chose to go out and have this duel, because at the beginning he said I'm not going to do it. But he even smiles at the end as he sees her go. Either that's her ghost or he's putting things together. Oh yeah, I remember seeing her when she was 13 and lived here. And he smiles, and he became so cynical as he got older. I mean, he even says to her when she sees that statue, it's like a Greek goddess statue, and the woman he's been waiting for was like a Greek myth or something of the love that comes to you, and then he says, "Oh, I don't believe in that anymore. That was when I was younger," and so he gave up his music. And we don't exactly know why. But I think you're right, because I was like, well, is he doing it? Didn't feel like he was doing it because he felt guilty, or if he felt, oh, I should do this for her. Or it felt more like, oh, I did have these things that I wanted, this love of my life. Maybe I missed it and I was ignorant enough to not see it, but it does give him something that's certainly positive that comes through.
I think that's interesting because I read his smile at the end, and I don't disagree with any of those. I mean, I think it's a masterstroke that we never see the duel, right?
Yeah.
It's a masterstroke that I almost read, I read that smile as more of the idea of, his behavior throughout this story is always trying to skirt the rules, is always trying to, evade responsibility, right? And in this moment, after receiving this letter from her and everything, he makes the decision of behaving honorably. You know what I mean? That he is actually accepting responsibility. And so I think that in that moment when he smiles and he goes out to the duel, he may live, he may die, could go either way, but he is, I'm not trying to just put this in some kind of like gendered perspective, but I mean, the idea of the time. We're talking like 1900s Vienna. In the parlance of the time, like he is being a man, he is taking responsibility. He is actually owning his mistake, because he got challenged to a duel and then he's going to run away from it. That's cowardly. That's dishonorable. It's always, he is finally going to step up and be a, as we would put it today, he's going to stand on business. He's going to actually stand by something and have some principles for a change. And I think learning that from this woman who stood by him through pretty much everything, even though he didn't see her, I think that's a powerful thing.
And you also read into that he's smiling because maybe he thinks he's hoping he's going to die, and maybe he's like, oh, maybe I'll meet the family I never had in the afterlife.
Yeah,
maybe there's actually something good coming for me. I don't know. Well, I think that's the master. Like you said, Matt, the masterstroke of the ending is that there's many ways to read him and his his final acts in the movie. Which again, the whole movie's great and all that, but just the ending is what really struck me. And I think people reading endings has kind of become a lost art these days, how a good ending can really elevate an already really good movie. And this was a really good movie, but that ending is kind of what really bumped it up a lot for me.
Well, I think you say that. I think it's a great point about how people read endings, because I think what ends up happening today is there's an ending and people kind of go, well, I know what it means, right?
Right.
And in this case, we know that he receives some kind of positive change from reading this letter. And we all just went around and like all of us named at least one or two things that could be that positive change from the end of that letter. And we don't need to know what that is, right?
Yeah.
I don't and shouldn't feel strongly enough about, well, he thinks he's going to die or anything like that. It's the fact that we know he got something out of it. And the joy is kind of, depending on what point of view you're coming at whatever time in your life, you can kind of come back to this and have a different reading of it. But the one thing that's clear is he is not hopeless by the end of this film. And I think that's really great.
Yeah. That's the beauty of it being open-ended, is that the storytellers are not telling you like, okay, this means this or that, whatever. It's whatever it is to you. And it's interesting that a guy who was such a player, who clearly slept with so many women that he didn't even remember this woman, didn't even see that she could potentially have been the love of his life. Obviously, he was the love of her life. It just goes to show you that you could have a lot of sex with a lot of women and still be not very happy, because it's sort of, maybe this is a weird example, but the film from 13 years ago, Shame, which is this character. I don't know if this character maybe had a sex addiction or something, but that's a guy who had a sex addiction and was having sex constantly, but was miserable because there was no feeling to it. It was just an addiction, like heroin's an addiction. So that's another weird angle, but clearly he just was never happy, and I think you're right. It did something. That's the main thing, is that it did something good for him.
Absolutely. And I think it's an interesting thing where Jourdan's character, it seems as though, because he's, often meeting up with women, taking them upstairs, many of them perhaps, women of the night, things like that. And you almost get the sense that even though he makes that comment to Joan Fontaine toward the end of, well, I was searching for this woman all this time, you get the sense of he really wasn't, right? He didn't necessarily think there was anything more than these casual encounters, and that these women would only want from him what he wanted from them, because you never really see him. I mean, you do see him be a little bit deceptive sometimes, but what you don't know, I think anyway, what you don't know is, like, is he saying these things because he is tricking some of these women, or does he just think, like, well, this is the nature of the game, right? It's 1900s Vienna. This is how we flirt, Like, you don't really know.
Yeah, you don't. And it's also her point of view, right?
Yeah.
So even though he's saying things like when they see each other again and she's now married and has her child, and he says to her, I know you from somewhere and I think you can help me. I know that sounds crazy. Those, if you just look at the words, those can be certainly interpreted as pickup lines.
Mm-hmm.
But because it's from her point of view, she's seeing it with, and I think the way to play it was perfect, because he's saying it with such passion and conviction, unless he was just a guy acting so well to try to pick her up. This, to me, anyways, it looked like that's just the way she saw it. And people do that all the time. I mean, when you really love someone, maybe there's a feeling that love is not reciprocated on the same level. And I've done that. I once was so into this when I was in high school, this girl, and I convinced myself that she felt the same way. And this character is also young, right? And we see her go from 13 to 30, and it's that impressionable age of where, and I'm not saying not only young people can have those experiences, because older people can too, but he must have felt the same way. And that feeds into her fantasies, and there's other things we can get into that also strongly suggest that she's someone who lives in certain fantasies,
Yeah, I think that's a great point about the kind of fantasy world that she lives in, and I think, or, somewhat flights of fancy that she lives in. I mean, one of the things that I think is really interesting about this film in particular is Jourdan, by all accounts, doesn't remember her, and at this point, when he's reading the letter, he's such an alcoholic that he doesn't remember much. And she is telling him all of this stuff, but of course, that's all coming from her point of view. This is her telling the story, right? And it's almost like one way to read this film and to read this ending is, of course, she is, when you're watching the movie, it's easy to kind of see it as, she's an obsessive, right? That she's kind of like, she's following around, she's going into his apartment, all of that. And they have this encounter. And I think one thing that's interesting is we don't know if everything she says in her story is true.
Right.
He doesn't know, but because he receives this positive, feeling from the end of it, and he decides to go so far as to go to this duel because of it, there is almost, to paraphrase another great film, there is almost a, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend element to it of like, okay, I can't prove that this woman, means everything she says, but that's the best possible outcome. Wouldn't you like to believe it? Isn't it pretty to think so?
Yeah, so I think the butler confirming that she existed, and like when he goes, "Oh, you knew it was her," and he gives him the nod, it's kind of like giving him the okay, basically, to believe the legend, like you're saying, because we don't know if any of this is true. We want to believe it's true since it's coming from her point of view, and we don't have a Rashomon style movie here where we see it from his point of view.
Right.
Mainly because it would be an NC-17 movie of just him just slamming puss the entire movie.
And listen, it's still by 1948 standards, it still gets pretty close to that if you consider it. There are moments that throw you off with this.
Still gets pretty horny. I mean, listen, this movie is ultimately a movie about, one, don't trust a French man and don't trust a musician. So when you put both of those two things together, it just becomes a nightmare where children die and women get the consumption and die. But yeah, I mean, all of that, the POV stuff really just ends up, and her believing her wanting to believe that he has the same feelings for her, even after all this time, even after abandoning her, blah, blah, blah. It leads to the best moment of her realizing how full of shit he is. Mm-hmm. That he's just, this is just his routine. He's doing the same thing, literally the same thing he did 9 years ago when we had sex. And you just go, oh God. Just the devastation in her face and her skulking out and the butler seeing her and just like, that's what I'm saying, man, of that ending where it gets from that point to him going off to the duel. That's where you just go, okay, this movie's really like kind of cooking on all cylinders with using the structure to enhance the thematic meat on the bone,
And I think
so good.
Tom,
also, fuck the French. I got to say it again.
That point you make about the the world of misery where the child dies. That's something that also struck me because watching this the first time, I think you're struck by how much it kind of gets around what we all think of as like the structures of the Hays Code, right? So many movies like this would have to add in. So I've seen plenty of them. I'm sure we all have from around this time period where the book involves a pregnancy out of marriage, but the movie has to make it like they got secretly married and then he died. And this doesn't have that. What I found out, though, is that the Hays Code still, the production code still had a rule for it, which is even though in the novella the child dies, one of the drafts of this script didn't have the kid dying, right? A little more hopeful. Kid's not dead. And the censorship board said, no, kid's got to die. You have to kill the kid. If there is, basically the ruling was if there is sin on screen, right? If there is going to be, premarital sex on screen, the woman has to die. The man has
to get punished.
Not just them. The kid has to be punished. It's like the product of this.
Yeah.
This love.
It is amazing that the Hays Code is anti-bastard.
Yeah. Yeah.
Nope. Kill the kid.
He had to die.
Wow. That's fucking hilarious.
Die. It's crazy. And again, that's one of those things.
That's amazing. Holy shit.
Yeah.
They were insane. I mean, I just recently read a book about the history, not the history of it, but how it was broken, mostly by Preminger and the Moon is Blue. It's a really interesting history, and just the things that Joseph Breen and all these guys thought was so hypocritical and were just insane, like literally insane.
Well, I mean, the entire. I mean, we'll get this show, and doing the show is going to involve a lot of us dealing with the Hays Code. As you deal with that time.
Lot.
But it is a fascinating thing in terms of like it supposedly exists to promote morality and decency. but in doing so, you kind of end up creating things that feel downright sick and sadistic, that it's got to be. We just did an episode, it'll probably come out before this, on Night of the Hunter, right?
Oh, yeah.
And talking about the fact that like that movie had to, whatever you think of the ending, had to end with Robert Mitchum getting his comeuppance, right? And the things that Charles Laughton does with that ending to kind of play around with our understanding of, like, you know, what exactly justice is, right? I mean, on that episode, Tom, you make the great point of, like, he could have just ended the movie with Mitchum getting arrested, right? Or he could have, but no, he expands on it, he builds on it, working within the strictures of that code. And I think similarly here, yeah. Sorry, Tom.
It's funny because I'm friends with Adam Green. If anybody listening knows the Hatchet movies or the other Frozen released in 2010, not the Disney one. That caused a lot of outrage at certain Redbox rentals when parents were renting the wrong Frozen for their kids. He says he would always tell me anytime we talk about this stuff about how with the MPAA now, when he was making the Hatchet movies, there was like one scene where, like, you know, someone's supposed to get like stabbed like 30 times, where the it's like supposed to be comically overkill, like where it's just, all right, this isn't even violent anymore, it's like a cartoon. But they were like, no, you got to cut it down. It's got to be like 1 or 2 stabs. And he made the arguments like, if it's just 1 or 2 stabs, that feels like real life, and you're actually making it more upsetting. And they're like, no, 30's too much. We have an arbitrary number of knife stabs we can have in the scene. And he's just like, guys, you're not going to like the outcome. And they didn't.
A great example of that, too, and we talked about it a couple of seasons ago, or I think it was last season, Frankenstein. Certain theaters in America did not want to include the scene where the monster throws the little girl in the water, right? Because you remember there's this scene, of course, you know, she's throwing the flies in the water, he picks her up and throws her. I'm saying it more for the audience's sake as well. Yeah. Trust me, I don't need to ask if you remember a scene from Frankenstein. That's
that's true.
When all of the personal memories fade, you'll still be able to tell people scenes from Frankenstein. I'm not worried about that.
Yeah, putting on the Ritz, yeah.
But he throws the girl in the water because he doesn't understand what he's doing, and she drowns. Certain theaters cut that scene out, so all you saw was Frankenstein approaching the monster, approaching the little girl, and the next thing you know, the father's carrying her dead corpse. And though they meant that as like let's protect people, in reality, the implications of you not knowing what happened and just seeing her corpse are so much darker than just including the scene. You know?
Yeah.
But that's
shit, that scene was missing until like what, the 80s or whatever. Yeah. Like it was basically not just some theaters. Basically, that became the de facto cut of the movie when it would play in TVs and just rep screenings for like decades. It's kind of still like a hot button issue with like horror people, because I know like Joe Dante and Guillermo think the scene shouldn't be in the movie. They think having it be that darker with it, the implication, not the Dennis Reynolds implication, but you know, close enough. They like it better. They like they like it better. So I like the scene because I think the creature needs to be a tragic figure, but I see that point. But yeah, I mean, sometimes these censorship boards are fucking so stupid.
But that's all to say, I mean, it is kind of remarkable to watch this film. I guess the thing that strikes me about this film in particular is how explicit it is in its sexuality and in its kind of moral ambiguity, knowing that rather than just bypassing the censors, it somehow managed to get this film through censorship is just a remarkable thing. You know, you wouldn't think it.
Oh yeah.
Well, the best filmmakers always were able to get around it. Yeah. I mean, that's why film noir is so good, because they knew how to get around the censors, and if anything, sometimes it makes it even steamier or sexier when things are not said. You know,
it made filmmakers have to be smarter. You know, and even today, you know, with where you basically can do anything you want on screen and everything. I kind of always go back to Carpenter's version of The Thing, which is, you know, landmark in terms of violence and special effects on screen. But even in that movie, he knows when to not show you something. Like especially at the end when they're they're about to blow everything up, and you don't see what happens to I can't remember his name, but it's the cook, the black cook. Where
I'm not going to remember.
McCready just turns around and he's gone. McCready just turns around and he's gone, and you're just like, This whole movie, we're seeing fucking bodies turn into spiders and limbs get chopped off and our chests become mouths and everything. But he also knows, just at this moment, I don't need to show you this thing. I don't. And sometimes, like you were just saying, Robert, sometimes it makes it steamier. Sometimes, like Mike said, it makes it more violent or more upsetting. It was, as much as I'm not like a lot of these dipshits on Twitter that think we need the Hays Code back or whatever, but I do think almost it was kind of like a necessary learning curve for filmmakers of like, okay, look at what filmmakers had to do with all of these restrictions. Now they're gone. Pick and choose when you're going to show something, when you're not going to show something. Make it a part of your cinematic playbook. And I don't want it back, but I'm kind of almost glad we had it when we did, especially so early in film history. Because if it happened, again, like if it happened now, it would just be devastating. Like there would just be like kind of no recovering, and every fucking movie would be like a Hallmark movie, and nobody. There's a lot of people that would want that, but
I'm saying, with this, and and what Ophuls doing in particular, I think the really impressive thing is, we're talking about all the ways he kind of works around things or his things. This is, less than 90 minutes of a movie, but it gives you absolutely everything that you need and nothing else. Like there's no fat to trim or anything, and every scene in it matters. It's a matter of not just economizing what it does to please censors, but it's also just an economy of storytelling. How it gives you everything.
It's just like a bullet out of a gun. It's just straight line, doesn't stop until it hits its intended target, which is the audience's fucking heart.
Yeah.
Well, his shot. I mean, he was able to do so much just with camera movements. I mean, he's known for his tracking shots. I mean, they're a strong influence on Stanley Kubrick and, French New Wave. And, particularly when she goes back to her house after her and her mother remarried and they move into another city, and then she goes back and she's waiting for him all night at the top of the staircase. And then he comes in with this woman, and the camera pans, and then they go in, and of course she's she knows he's already has a lot of female friends, and we know, here's another pickup of his, and then later when he meets her, it's the exact same shot. So right at the top of the staircase, and it pans over, and they go in, and of course right there he's telling you there's so much meaning there that she is another number, so to speak. It's meaningless, and he didn't need tons of dialogue. And I'm not saying that I love dialogue-driven films. This is a pretty heavy dialogue film, but it is amazing sometimes how you can make something so emotional and pack such a punch with moving moving the camera in a certain way. Repeating those shots. Other things are repeated in the film too, which I'm sure we'll touch on. But those two things, and doing the exact same shot, moving in at those moments, I mean, it's incredible. It's unbelievable how much is right in those moments.
And one of my favorite shots too that he does, just speaking of the camera movement, it's they go to that first, when he's with her, they go to that first restaurant, right? And he's bouncing between all the people, and she's just kind of wallflower watching him, right? Oh, monsieur, do this. And then they leave to get in the carriage. And rather than the camera following them, the camera turns and seems to peer over a window, right? You're seeing the bottom of the window and watching them through this kind of fogged glass.
Yeah.
And I love that because it feels voyeuristic, and it suddenly takes what is a wholesome, could be seen as a wholesome, cute scene, and just because you're now in the position of somebody watching through a window, it now feels scandalous without ever doing anything risque. I think it's such a
something dangerous. He did that. I don't know if you guys watch The Pleasure or La Pleasure, I believe. My French is not the best, but he does that because that's about like these prostitutes in a brothel. So often the camera's right outside the window, and it makes it so scandalous, Yeah, no, I mean, he doesn't move it a ton, but a decent amount he does, and every time he does, it unpacks so much. And another thing I really like that I didn't pick up on until I saw it again, and she talks about this in the voiceover, is life being not about chance, but things being measured, and the element of fate. And, you know, is this all happening by chance, or was it meant to happen? Mm-hmm. And there's even little moments, for example, when she talks about when she turns 18, and now her parents want her to, like, basically marry and go into society. And she meet this soldier who has an eye for her. When they meet in the street, you'll notice that a carriage goes by. Mm-hmm. And it's very loud, and they have to move on to the sidewalk, and it interrupts the meeting, and we don't actually hear the dialogue of them meeting. And, maybe that doesn't sound like such a big deal, but there's just something bumpy about it, and it just almost seems like it's spoiled any kind of initial spark. It's subtle, but and there's so many characters that populate the frame, and she talks about that. We meet so many people in our life. Why is it that some people stick in our minds? Why do they become so much a part of our lives, or change our lives forever? Is it measured, or is it by chance? It's an interesting question to ponder.
But I also think it's so interesting that she offers that idea, right, of kind of, fate and things that happen and things being determined, right? And he, as a person, Jourdan's character, is kind of a guy who just drifts through life, one thing to the next, right? Absent any sort of purpose. And reading her letter gives him purpose. Meanwhile, she tries to treat, and her descriptions of moments are like, well, this, and then, you were fated to look at me, and, the day you chose to see me. Meanwhile, she, without necessarily acknowledging it, outlines in her letter, like, no, I want to be clear. I built myself up to be the kind of person you want. I started reading because I saw you had books.
Yeah,
I learned music. And she is following him around, and she goes to all of his shows, right?
Right.
That what she kind of chalks up to, in some cases, chalks up to destiny or fate. She is absolutely in charge of these outcomes. She turns down the Austrian soldier, or the soldier, wherever, she turns down the soldier. She follows him around. She just leaves her husband, she takes off to go see him again. And she's so in control, even though she doesn't acknowledge it. She's putting herself in that path. And I think that that's kind of, one of the things that nowadays, with the kind of movies we all talk about, the kind of post-70s movies, people would love this, but in 1948, you wonder, like, were people ready for a movie? Not ready for, but, at this specific time, like Tom said about, this post-war feeling, like making a movie that it's a melodrama that essentially goes, these are two broken people, broken in opposite ways. These are two people who, it's not a case of he's a broken man and she's a virtuous soul that saves him. You can't watch this movie in good conscience and go, no, there's nothing off about either of these people. There's something.
No, she's a fucking nut. She's a fucking nut.
Thing. It is that kind of thing.
If she was a guy, the movie's fucking Taxi Driver.
Or if it was made, today,
that's an interesting comparison.
Tom, if it was made today, it might be Misery. Because remember, he's a novelist in the original short story. But the thing about it is, like, they both give each other what they need, even though those needs are not the conventional things one is supposed to need,
Well, no, because the French have no morals, so,
Hopefully no one from France is watching.
Listen, I'll take them on. It's fine.
But she also becomes a questionable narrator when she, I love the scene in the carnival where they're taking those, like, that train ride. And when it first started,
I love it.
And we all know back then rear projection was the norm. But I was thinking at first, that's a terrible rear projector. What were they thinking? And then when he steps out, I'm like, oh, it's a ride. But she talks about the fact that oh, I went all these travels with my father, and then he's traveled a lot too. He kind of catches her in a lie, and like, oh well, where I've been to Brazil, and she's like, well, I have to admit, actually, it was a fantasy of my father and I used to act out. And again, so it makes her. I mean, we all lie, right? Occasionally, even if we tell a story, we can't question every little thing about everybody. But when we're looking at it in the context of a story, it's like, oh, well, this is someone who sort of is lives in her head a little bit, and she's also sort of oblivious of others around her, and we see that in that great date night they have, and I don't blame them. When you get so caught up in the moment, those poor musicians who wanted to get the hell out of there, also adds to the humor. But we also see that when he's moving in, and she kind of just like goes up the stairs like all those movers who are like complain, I'm not moving a musician again. This is a pain in the ass. It also made it more realistic and it enriched the frame, but at the same time it shows like it's just interesting that she would just run up there as if there was no one around. I just thought that's so interesting.
I just want to note, because you mentioned the musicians, Robert. I'll touch on the carriage scene too, but you mentioned, the train scene. You mentioned the musicians. Now, Tom, he doesn't necessarily keep track, but Tom has his own kind of semi-Hall of Fame as we go through this show. Small, kind of insignificant characters that just really vibe with him. The most famous, of course, being Mickey Doolan of the Salmon Alley Boys in Poor Little Rich Girl. Just one-off characters that he vibes with. Tom,
right?
We're talking about the all-female band. Does angry female bassist aggressively chomping a sausage earn a place in your Hall of Fame of ancillary characters? That felt, when that scene pops up and they cut to her shot, I was just like, this feels like Tom's vibing with this.
That's a very specific kink of mine. So yeah. First ballot unanimous. First ballot unanimous Hall of Fame. The Mariana Rivera of one-off weird characters in these fucking movies.
Somebody, you don't remember how many you've picked out, but I guarantee you somebody out there remembers them. Somebody's got the list.
And if they do, I hope they don't know where I live, because that would be psychotic.
They're good. Tom, when you are old and about to go into a duel, they are going to write you a letter that says, you don't remember me, you don't know who I am, but here are all the ancillary characters that you said you liked in the National Film Registry. Robert, you mentioned the train. One thing I love is that Ophuls, came up with that whole carnival sequence. He came up with a lot of this from his own memories of Vienna and just Europe and growing up there. So he infuses a lot of that personality into it. And I think that really helps this film because, look, and we've all watched a lot of movies from this era. A lot of times when there's a movie set in some European country, a Hollywood movie set in a European country, a lot of times that setting is just to make it feel exotic. And you kind of watch it and go, you guys don't know what this country is. It'll just be like, oh, this is set in Germany in the 1800s. We've got one Oompa band and one pair of lederhosen. That's enough. But this comes from such an authentic place and such an honest place. And I love the idea of, sitting in the train car with the little things passing you, the papers passing about which scene you are. And then when Jourdan, they say, hey, you've done them all. All right, let's revisit the scenes of our youth. I love it.
Right.
It's such a
it's another fantasy. Or, it's another form of escape, and it is interesting because he keeps paying to have to keep going with the ride or to start again. It sort of reminded me of if you're at a bar and you keep ordering drinks, for the person you're with because you want to take it to the next step. He's trying to prolong that outing because ultimately he wants to sleep with her, right? So I thought that was something very interesting.
But I think it's more than just he wants to sleep with her. I think that at the end of the day, the act of flirting, the act of this kind of flirtation is, even though it's going to be, in most cases, a quick thing or something like that, it's play acting like it could be more, right? And I think that, when he's in that train, that fake train with her, right? because he's so used to the play acting of flirtation, right? The play acting of, oh, you know what, for a night, let's just act like we're in love. And he doesn't see that she's not pretending, that she actually harbors these feelings because she's known him that long. And I think that, for him, when you see the way he flirts, when you see the way he talks to these women, for him, it's like, great, I know the tricks I need to pull to feel loved for a little bit. And he doesn't necessarily realize that this isn't just a trick with her, that this could be something, because he's just so used to those people walking away, those people not being a part of his life anymore, And I think that that's what makes that scene so sweet and also heartbreaking, is that, it'd be one thing if he was just a cad, right? But you have to wonder in those moments, like, he is enjoying himself and he's enjoying her company,
Oh, that's
certainly.
And that's like the ultimate, question at the end is, do you think he actually does have feelings for her, and that's why something changes in him with the letter? Like, even if he doesn't realize, obviously he doesn't realize it, but like, do you think to him, seeing this letter, it like made him realize, fine, like it came to the surface, wait, I actually did have feelings for this girl? I'm not saying if, I think it's an ambiguous thing. Do you guys think he actually did have feelings for her that he just didn't realize?
I don't think it's a matter of him having had feelings for her so much as I think this is a man who, when you look at the way he's behaved, he wants to be loved, right? And not he wants to be adored. There's an emptiness there that he is trying to fill, right? A lot of people talk about, and when they have a child, right? And this baby finally recognizes them and grabs their finger or something like that, and there's this feeling of like, oh, this overwhelming feeling of like, oh my God, there's this person, this tiny person loves me unconditionally, right? That's an incredible thing. And, I think for him, this is a guy who, at least to me, has never had that love in a real way. There have been women, but it's always been a quick thing. And I think it doesn't matter that he didn't really know her. It doesn't matter if he can remember her or not. In the moment when he turns to the butler and the butler gives him a name, and now she has a name and he has the story and he has all of that, and she had a son, he comes away from it knowing that he was loved. And I think that's the more profound thing, is that, that he's feeling is it doesn't matter whether or not in the moment he loved her, but rather like, oh, Tom, you say it a lot about, this is a weird pull in this one, but you say it a lot about your read on Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, where you say, your read on that film is it doesn't matter who you are, you matter to somebody, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think this is the epitome of that to me, is it's the reading that letter when you're a guy who's like about to skip town because somebody wants to shoot you and you don't even question why, to read this letter and have this feeling of like, oh, I mattered to someone. I had a son, I had a woman who loved me, I had all of that. I mattered there. I had love. I think that's kind of to me anyway, that's my read on that. But obviously, Robert, it's however you feel on it.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I like what you're both saying, and it's making me think more about his perspective, because it's all from her perspective. And I think it's even at the end, after he looks to his butler and says, "Do you remember her?" And the butler just nods, and then he gets these images of seeing her. We still don't really have any insights into his feelings. So I think it's really hard to say. He clearly knew her. We know that he slept with her, and we know that he took off. Why? Maybe when things get too real, he runs, right? Which is a possibility. But I certainly know that I've, perhaps went on a date when I thought, oh, I don't know if I'm really that interested in this person, and then found that I was, right. So, so it's the mystery. I'm sort of more interested in the mystery of his feelings, because I think it's it's not really meant to be known. I think it's more about, her story and her tragedy and how she saw this, and like that no one knows the answers of these feelings. It's interesting. You can come up with so many different interpretations, right? It's interesting.
Because you could, if there's one thing that makes me think that maybe he did actually have feelings for her and that it was just, he wasn't ready or blah, 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 whatnot, is how frantic he is when he sees her at the opera house. Like, like he's like, it's like this bug in his, like on his mind where he's just like, why? I know she has to be important. Why can't I remember her? Like, there's this like intensity to him that's more than his usual flirtatious style we've seen before, where you go, why is he so intense right now? Why is he so like,
which makes me wonder. Yeah, which makes me wonder, is that just how she sees it? Because if you look at the words that he's saying, I'm not saying that he maybe didn't come across that way. If you look at the words he's saying, it is very classic pickup line thing. Don't I know you from somewhere? It's totally, the audience in a lot of ways is totally in the dark about him because we don't have the Rashomon,
And I'll say not just him, because there's a great moment, when the husband, her husband, is talking to the son, his stepson, and the stepson is talking about, in school and oh, he said I had a natural talent for music, and the stepfather withdraws, and again you're kind of sitting there as the viewer going, how much does he know?
Oh, I didn't even think of that.
Yeah. And I think that, in both cases, another way to read it too, because Tom, you mentioned how frantic he was when he saw her, right? The other question with that, if that is how he was, right? Yeah. If that is really how he was, the other question is, how conscious is he of why he's reacting like that? Yeah. He's also intoxicated and all those things. It's entirely possible that he sees her and his body reacts, and maybe there is a memory of this person in the back of his mind, but gun to his head, he could not tell you why he remembers or recognizes that person, right?
Yeah, and 100%.
Yeah,
I think his drinking also comes into play. I mean, we don't know if he's an alcoholic, but he's drinking a lot, and he even mentions, not to laugh at that, it's, but he even, as she comes later, he's like, oh, we got champagne. He wants to have champagne. It's the morning, I mean, champagne in the morning is kind of an alcoholic, so I mean, I've known alcoholics and memory. A friend of mine was an alcoholic, and I remember, I would ask him, do you remember this, that? He's like, when he was drinking heavily, I don't remember any of that.
Yeah.
So that's another thing that comes into it.
I know you said you're not going to call him an alcoholic. I'm going to go out there on a limb. I'm going to put myself out there. I feel comfortable diagnosing Louis Jourdan's character in this movie as an alcoholic. I will take the hit for that. I feel comfortable.
I think that's fair.
My shot on that one.
Yeah, he's an alcoholic.
I think that's fair. Yeah.
He's an alky.
Yeah, he's having a rough one.
Mainly just, I just find that question about his feelings for her interesting, because the ending of this movie, in a way, reminds me of the ending of Past Lives.
Yeah.
Of like, the one person moves on and is not available anymore, and then the one person who wasn't available the whole movie now switches places and is the one that's emotional and like realizing what they've missed. So
I haven't seen that yet.
Oh,
when you said it, I had to Google it. I'm like, oh yeah, this was a big one last year.
It's
great movie.
But it's interesting, Tom, because you say that that it's similar to our discussion after Past Lives, which is you and I both affected profoundly by that movie, but for completely different reasons. And I do think that one of the things that really works with this film, I mean, I'm not going to pull back the curtain too much, but I certainly, Tom can attest, I was, I dated a bit in high school and college. And there will certainly be times, even in my own life, you catch up with people later and they'll go, do you remember when you did this? Do you remember when, we went out and we rode this ride and we did this thing? And you almost have to kind of go, because you don't want to be the person to go, I actually don't remember that at all. But like you kind of, but there's a, that's a mixed feeling, because there's a sadness to things like that, because you kind of go, oh man, I wish I remember that. That sounds really nice, but also that you meant so much to somebody that they remember that. That's such a, aside from the romantic element, and even there's something so, I think, very comforting and weirdly powerful when somebody comes up to you and goes like, you haven't seen them in years, and they go, oh man, I remember this day. You got up in front of the whole room and you did this whole song and dance number, and you've no recollection of that. But to somebody else, that was so powerful or so memorable that 10, 15 years later, they still remember it. And so while there is a tragedy to this, and that she has died and all of that, there is that positive of like, here's this guy at his, one of his lowest points, realizing he mattered. I think that's really something beautiful.
And even just the look, I mean, it's such a powerful moment when he realizes that she's dead, and the music just elevates the image as the tears in his eyes. I was like, wow, that was just such a beautiful, painful realization, of what has happened to this woman. It's just like she died while she was writing it. And the little note that says she was saying your name was the last word, Stefan, or I thought that was pretty remarkable, and just the element of things being measured, or the element of fate that is explored. It's so interesting that we see the son die because of this one compartment that needed to be quarantined that they walked into. Of all, she talks about people in your life, things happening by. We meet so many people, of all the people in there, that they were the ones to walk in there and then get sick and then die.
That fucking reveal of the on the train of just the camera panning and you see a body and you're just like, oh, what the fuck is this now? It's like, oh, somebody on the train had typhus, and you just go, you gotta be fucking kidding me! Come on,
you just know, you just know, and it's also that
you
thing.
Just have,
Mom,
you just throw your hands up. Yeah,
and he's also saying to her.
You just throw your hands up and you just go, God, you just throw your hands up and go, God fucking damn it, this woman cannot catch a break.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And he says the same thing to her. Oh, Mom, I'll see you in 2 weeks. Just like, and she almost has an instinct of like, oh, this sounds familiar. Yeah. When the biological father of this boy said the same thing. See you in 2 weeks, right? So again, it's the element of things being measured and things by chance. Like I just, you guys were talking about magnificent ampersands. I just did like a crash course on Wells because I interviewed Joseph McBride, one of the Wells scholars. And man, he had a lot of good luck naturally, but he had a lot of bad luck. And sometimes you just wonder, how the hell how can so many things have gone wrong? It's a mystery, right? I think that's very interesting in this movie.
But even then, I think it's a great point when we're talking about the, unreliable narrator of it all, right? Not that she's necessarily lying even, but, when it all boils down to it, did Louise Jourdan really say, I'll see you in 2 weeks, and the son said, I'll see you in 2 weeks? Or does she remember Louise Jourdan giving the time frame to the son did? Because I think one thing that's great is toward the end of the film, for most of the movie, she is just convinced she cannot see any alternative other than, well, we're meant to be together and like we'll get back together. And then after this final encounter with Jourdan and she's leaving the apartment, when the other guy on the street mistakes her for a prostitute, and you see the horror on her face, and you as the audience kind of have to sit back and go, is this the first time you considered that? Like, it seems like that's the first time the illusion has been shattered, and she's like, oh, I'm just another one of the, like, this is how I'm coming off. This is the vibe I'm having. I'm not following destiny. I'm just making a reckless decision. So you have to question up until that point, like, you mentioned, Robert, how many bad things can happen to a person or anything like that. I mean, there's also the element of the story we tell ourselves, the narrative we create, right?
Right.
The human brain loves patterns. So we often see patterns even when they're not there. We often see we look for the connection. We look for, well, this happened and therefore this happened. And one has to wonder how much of her story, at least the story she's telling, is consciously or not kind of creating this narrative, right? And building this thing where it's all about him. And, what about the elements he's not involved in? We don't really know,
Yeah, it's all questionable.
So without any further ado, as we always wind down on, Tom, how do you think Letter from an Unknown Woman fared at the Academy Awards that year?
0 nominations.
That is correct and also infuriating. Because you watch this movie and you're like, nothing for score, nothing for art direction, nothing. So that's correct. It was not nominated for any Oscars, which was what I think the studio had been hoping it would get some love, but it did not. The Best Picture nominees that year were Johnny Belinda, The Red Shoes, The Snake Pit, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, and the winner, Hamlet. So that was that year.
It makes you wonder how many things have slipped through the crack every single year since cinema has started, particularly now. There's I tried to figure out how many movies I've seen, and I gave up after going through the IMDb. It's just there's too many movies made. And you think, wow, they, in the 30s and 20s, they were making maybe 2,000 movies a year worldwide. Now it's something like 20, 30,000. Yeah. You got to think there's probably so many movies that we'll never know. It's just impossible. That could probably be masterpieces. It's interesting.
And now they're all just sitting on Tubi for no one to watch.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's
exactly.
They're all just there. It is.
They're out there at least.
The amount of times we were talking about it before we started recording. Like, you'll go on Tubi and there'll be a lot of like garbage, and there will also be. But then you'll look and there's just like a whole trove of like Roy Rogers westerns just sitting here that no one has thought.
There's always something. Yeah. There's always every streamer has something. You're like, whoa, how did this is on? Tubi or whatever.
Yeah. Type in like Bud Boddicker on Tubi and you'll be like, I didn't know he made half these movies. It's crazy. Right. But Robert, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you coming back on, and especially taking on this film. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. And this was, I don't know when I would have got to this film, if I would have gotten to it. So it was great to explore it and discover more about it when I heard both of your takes on it. So this was great. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you so much. Please plug away. Tell folks what to check out, where to find you, what to follow, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, so my YouTube channel is youtube.com/Robert Bellissimo at the movies, and it's basically what I call sort of like my own film school. Like I'm learning from people like the two of you coming on and exploring cinema. So I call it an exploration of cinema, where we do deep dive movie reviews similar to this show, and also interviews with people who work in film, mostly film books that come out. I'll have a lot of the writers come on and discuss various film books. You can find me on X or Twitter, however people want to call it these days, at RB at the movies. And on Instagram, I am at Robert Bellissimo at the movies. Did I miss anything? Do people use Blue Sky? I'm also on Blue Sky, which is like the new Twitter.
I've heard tell of it. I'm aware it exists. We have not gotten the invites, but I've heard.
It's exactly like X or Twitter. How it's the exact same thing. People who have boycotted X because of Musk there. It's literally a new Twitter. So yeah, if you just type in my name, I'm on there as well.
Absolutely, and we can for the people watching this on our YouTube, we can link to one of your videos at the end of this. So let it play out and then let it autoplay, and you'll be watching even more of Robert when this is done. So it all works out.
Nice,
Robert. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope to have you back again. We hope to be on your show again. Hopefully, I can make it this time, unless I need another major surgery. Who can say? But we will see you around. But everybody else, stick around. We'll be right back with our picks for the National Film Registry.
The National Film Registry isn't some fixed object, frozen in time. It's always growing, adding new titles every year. These annual selections are made by the National Film Preservation Board, with members like Martin Scorsese, Alfre Woodard, and Leonard Maltin, and representatives from organizations like the Academy, the DGA, and the AFI coming together to debate and decide. But they don't just pull titles out of thin air. They pull from the public, people like you and us, who can submit their nominations for the registry in a form on the Library of Congress's website. What we do, at the end of each episode, is have Mike and Tom pick films not yet in the registry that they feel should be, inspired by that day's topic. At the end of each season, those films will be formally submitted to the National Film Registry for consideration on behalf of You're Missing Out. Here are today's picks.
So this was interesting. I think I was kind of in a position. It was strange to think of something that really connected to this. There's nothing that resonates with this, but of course, there are a number of directions one can go with this film. From the melodrama direction to just the people in its cast. But one of the things that's interesting is to parallel this film with a film that came out 5 years before it. This film is, of course, a melodrama about a man who doesn't realize all of the sort of the gravity of his life and the consequences of his actions. He's completely unaware of them until the final moments when he discovers the kind of person he was and the kind of character he was, and he tries to do right. And I think if you were doing a double bill, which apparently this was trimmed down to be a part of, one thing it might play really well with is another European refugee director's film from 5 years earlier. But in this case, in this film, it's not a man only finding out at the very end the consequences of his actions. It is instead a man making a case or a man making a case for his life and his, as he deems it, bad behavior, and making that case to Satan himself, because he feels he deserves a place in hell, and this film is going to show his explanation for why he deserves eternal damnation. I'm going to say a title here, but I'm going to warn any of you folks, it's probably not the movie you're thinking of. I'm picking for the registry Heaven Can Wait, but not the Warren Beatty one that took that title. That's a remake of Here Comes Mr. Jourdan. The original Heaven Can Wait, which has nothing to do with Here Comes Mr. Jourdan. That is by director Ernst Lubitsch, stars Don Amici. It's a great film with a lot of heart and sincerity. Lubitsch obviously gets more respect in the States, especially in his day, than Max Ophuls does, but they have a similar vibe, especially in this film. We think of Lubitsch for the very, the Lubitsch touch of his comedies. Heaven Can Wait is a more dramatic film than that, but it is a very deeply touching film, and I think functions sort of, especially in the way that its own ending has its catharsis. Without spoiling it, I'll just say they function as sort of equal and opposite. They kind of contrast each other really well, both thematically and rhythmically. So, it's one of Lubitsch's great films, even though, again, most people, when they hear the title Heaven Can Wait, just assume it is a remake of Here Comes Mr. Jourdan because the Beatty film is a remake of Here Comes Mr. Jourdan. It's a very different film. It's not what you're expecting, and that's what makes it such a pleasant surprise. So I think, I don't think anyone's going to argue with more Lubitsch in the registry. I certainly wouldn't, and Heaven Can Wait is one of his finest works and a deeply emotional, very touching film. So I think it fits perfectly with Letter from an Unknown Woman and deserves a place in the National Film Registry.
Yeah, so this one was a little hard for me too. I just really didn't know what angle to take until I was looking at this big old wall of shit behind me, and it hit me kind of pretty immediately, where I went, oh, this is kind of too perfect, especially for me. It's a filmmaker I think should be represented in the registry, because I think he's one of the best filmmakers of this current generation of the last 30 years. And I know that's kind of a hot take, but I truly believe it. And I can't believe I didn't think about it immediately, but narratively they're very similar, but they go about it in very different ways. My pick is All the Real Girls by David Gordon Green. It's almost to the point, almost like his remake of this movie, mainly because it's about a womanizer dating a younger woman, and how he kind of falls in love with her, and it kind of fucks with his head, and how she unfalls out of love with him. And not like Letters from an Unknown Woman stylistically. It's one of Gordon Green's neo-realist movies. not as tragic, again, he's not going for the big emotional swings here. He's not going melodrama. He's going neorealistic. So it's sad, but it's not, 9-year-old gets lupus and then a woman dies of the consumption before a French musician goes to fight a duel. Not going to lie, wish at least one of those elements was in the movie just to give you a little bit of a, what the fuck? But I think this would actually be quite the interesting double feature to watch. I think Gordon Green is one of the premier important American voices in film since his debut in 2000 with George Washington, another movie I suggested for the registry a few seasons back. I think this is one of his best movies, and I think it's one of the best independent movies of the 21st century. And for its connections to Letters from an Unknown Woman, I think it's pretty much a perfect pair. So yeah, I'm throwing my hat in the ring for All the Real Girls.
Next week,
Amy Nicholson joins us today to talk about Salesman.
They're on the cusp of, a lot of people probably sort of pulled back from being so specifically religious at that point, because you're headed into the 70s, where things were a lot more free-flowing. And so it's almost like the pall on it is not the sadness of the guys and the fact that they have to work so hard to just make $5, is really more like it's all slipping away.
You're Missing Out is a production of Neon Night Media. It's hosted by Mike Natali and Tom Lorenzo. The show is produced by Kyle Lampard and edited by Mike Natali and Kyle Lampard. More information about our hosts and guests are in the show notes. Thank you to Amanda Rush for our social media, and all of you for checking us out.
If you're listening right now or want to take the show on the go, every episode is available as an audio podcast. Follow You're Missing Out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you hear, please leave a review and rating. It helps folks find the show.
Want to watch the show or watch some of the films along with us? Great, that's why we're doing this. Don't leave us alone out here. Check out our YouTube channel. We've got video versions of every episode, uploads of some of the National Film Registry titles we're discussing, commentary tracks, and live streams. And once a month, I'll be uploading some content that's exclusive to the YouTube channel. So be sure to click subscribe and hit that little bell to be notified as soon as new stuff goes up. Because, let's be fucking real, I ain't sticking to a goddamn schedule.
So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
And we'll see you next time.
And you'll see us next time, because we don't watch you, you're watching us.